I am going to talk about Capra Masquerade, which is a Moldavian tradition that happens between Christmas and New Year in North East Romania. I am not an academic or expert on Romania, but an artist who spent 3 years living there between 2002 and 2005 and became captivated by this tradition. Capra, which means goat, is both the name of the masquerade and one of the chief figures that occurs in it. Here is a map, and we can see Moldavia around Bacău, Piatra Neamț, Târgu Neamț, and to the west, Transylvania. You can also see the country Moldova, not to be confused with the Romanian area of Moldavia. I am also going to talk about the village life in which it takes place. Villages in many parts of Romania in the early 2000s were still extremely rural, with very few cars and many without running water. I will talk about my experience of one village, Mulankrav, in Transylvania, which I came to know when I spent many weeks drawing there between 2002 and 2006. It shares many of the same features as Moldavian villages, so I am using it as an example, as I never got to know any Moldavian villages in the same way. I will illustrate this talk with a mixture of photographs of Capra Masquerade, some of which we took ourselves, and drawings I made while living in Romania. How did I first come across Capra? I first came across Capra Masquerade when I saw strangely costumed characters getting out of a tube train in Bucharest in 2004. I was instantly bewitched. The costumes were fantastical against the still grey leftovers of communism in subways unadorned by advertising. The Roma music that accompanied the little band was haunting. Like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, they magically caused me to follow them out of the station until I lost them on the crowded streets. I asked everyone about these theatrical characters until I found a taxi driver who told me they were from a masquerade tradition in Moldavia. But, he said, what I had witnessed was not Moldavians, but Roma, who had stolen their heritage to profiteer on the streets of Bucharest. He was extremely cross about this, and I will talk later about the part Roma communities traditionally play in Capra. So I looked around second-hand bookshops near Bucharest University to find out more about these extraordinary visions, and found old ethnographic books of Romanian village life produced in communist times, wonderful photos of people in animal costumes, goats, bears, horses, deer, as well as masked men and women. And I started to draw them from these books. The old photos in the books were of costumes made from old patched and darned carpets and textiles and hand-woven embroidered cloths called prosop and embroidered sheepskin waistcoats. The masks were often like outsider works of art and made of wood or metal or sheepskin, some even of pottery. Some of the Capra masks had bizarrely formed horns, others real horns attached to wooden goats' heads. On the masks of the old men, the mosh, were often long protruding clown-like red noses, quite fantastical, and bear costumes so realistic it was hard to tell if it was not a real dancing bear. And there was a wildness in some of the photos, mischievous characters on the top of telegraph poles, or climbing over high fences into people's private yards, as in this watercolour, and all of this in the silence of snow. Or at least it used to be until recently, when winters have become warmer. The taxi driver was from Târgu Neamț, where he said there were great processions at New Year. I persuaded my family they needed a New Year holiday in Moldavia, and off we went. We arrived in Târgu Neamț with the 3-day festival already in full swing. It was not quite the same as in the old books. The masquerade seemed to fill the entire town centre with bands of players in every quarter and crowds of supporters and bystanders. Everywhere, cacophony of drums, whistles, trumpets, and cries, and fireworks, which we were soon told were a new departure with the arrival of cheap Chinese ones in Romania. They were being set off all over the place with little heed to thoughts of safety. Later, we saw someone hit in the eye by a rocket and heard that they had had to have their eye removed. I would never take children to such a dangerous celebration again. One of the loudest sounds was the rattling of cans on costumes designed, we thought, with the idea of being as noisy as possible. These characters rambled around the streets, becoming increasingly intoxicated as the day wore on. Then there were huge horns that were over 10 feet long, that were blown at irregular intervals, accompanying the revellers, who from time to time broke off to form circle dances around a single character. Then revellers included quite a few cross-dressing characters, huge plastic boobs proudly worn by big men with long, flowery hippie skirts, often lifted to show off pantomime knickers. Dancing broke out, sometimes lascivious in style. And in the midst of all of this, we spotted a Mrs. Thatcher mask. This day of revelling, we were told, occurred after each village had had their own processions and the Capra groups congregated in the town for a day of masquerade. The processions, with their clattering and booming sounds, their cries and bright array of costumes, continued until dusk, when groups collected to walk back to their villages in the silence of the snowy landscape. On our meanderings around the town, we happened to chance upon the open doors of a small museum where we saw a Capra costume proudly displayed with a label informing us it had been made by a community project that helped people get back to work. It was for sale for €100. The carpet, that was the most part of the costume, was new and had been made on the project, as well as the wooden head, with tassels and bells and sheep's teeth. It had real goat's beard and protruding wooden eyes. It was a bargain which we quickly asked to buy. The keepers of the museum were incredulous we were happy to pay the full amount, and went to get the mayor, who shook all our hands, so delighted were they that their scheme for unemployed people had proved successful. This goat has been part of our family, earning its keep at fundraising fetes, pay to have your photo taken with a goat, etc., etc., and regularly comes out to entertain young visitors in our garden during summer months. While the mask we bought enlivens our dead winter garden from New Year till the appearance of the first bulbs. It has eyes of walnut shells with holes in the middle, a gourd for a nose, and teeth that are alternating beans and pieces of goose quill. But what is Capra about? I wanted to find out more. I could then just about read simple Romanian and discovered it was part of a whole chain of similar masquerades that had ancient pre-Christian roots and occurred in many different European countries, notably Switzerland and Bulgaria. In Moldavia, they were said to be about the driving away of evil spirits from villages at the turn of the year. I came across Romanian academics who focused on the ancient roots, quoting medieval sources, with one talking about the relocation of the human spirit in animals after death, which explained the array of animals in Capra, the goat, bear, horse, deer, the stork and fox, amongst others. Another paper wrote about the Christian belief that during Christmas night, the tombs opened and the ghosts and dead spirits went out into the world until the 12th night. And then another quoted a 7th century Archbishop of Canterbury, who decreed that any person who would disguise in stag or ox for the January carols would suffer a 3-year interdiction, as that practice is demonic. A member of the Romanian Cultural Institute told me an English anthropologist from the British Museum, Sarah Posey, had recently studied Capra traditions for a PhD. When back in the UK, I got in touch with her and went to the British Library to read her thesis. Much of what follows comes from my reading of this. She studied one Capra from 1993 to 2002 in the village of Câmpeni. Not every village in Moldavia has a capra, and the structure and content of the festivities varies from village to village, with each masquerade giving identity to its village. Roughly, they cover the time between Christmas and New Year and finish with a dance in a village hall. In Câmpeni, there were 5 days of capra. All the players are male and in Câmpeni between about 7 and 24 years old, with the leader, the chef, in his 30s. The troupe tried to gain entry into households with teenage girls or girls in their 20s. Nearly every man had at one time been in Capra, and it was something that bound them together as a community. It also was a connection between generations, something grandfathers, fathers, and sons could all talk about. The Capra plays out through a series of animal characters, which are not exactly the same in each village. They walk, process, and perform dances around the village and are accompanied by noise and music, often gypsy music. They gain entry into houses with marriageable young women. There is great play and comedy about inviting themselves into the homesteads, which at first are unwilling to have them, but when they do get in, they are welcomed with food and drink. The dancing and talk can be lewd as well as comic. It is a carnival of inversion, the only time in the year where the rather austere village norms can be ignored. Capra is about clever talking, bargaining, humour, crossing boundaries, and turning upside down social norms in a way that most of the year would be totally unacceptable, and of young men getting inside the houses of girls they fancied. But what are the characters of Capra? I'll talk about some of them and show you images of the characters, mostly as I saw them in 2004, but some old photos and some my watercolours. I shall read you Pose's descriptions of the costumes she saw in Câmpeni in the mid-1990s, and you will see what we witnessed less than a decade later was very different. The goat, the Capra, is a trickster and often leads the way into a house once entry has been granted. And this, of course, is an old image. He is masked, often rather in the fashion of horses of English Morris men, with wide opening mouth. He has horns and is dressed in textiles and old carpets. Sometimes the neck of the goat is elongated to look more like a giraffe, giving it an even more fantastical air. The youngest boys can form a troop of horses and are not masked, but sometimes wear hats and have wooden structures they walk inside, with horses' heads which they hold by reins. Their clothes are embroidered. The Roma-like badana wear Wellington boots, multicoloured pantaloons made from women's clothes and sleeves from hand-embroidered fabrics, a mask and embroidered waistcoats. In Câmpeni, their masks were of beaten aluminium, with gnarled noses, with little holes for eyes, and sheepskin beards, with sheep's teeth and moustache of boar or horsehair. You can see in this picture how different were the badana we saw. There were only one mosh and one baba, and this old man and old woman are the comic characters. The mosh is dressed in traditional male costume, a belted embroidered long shirt, straight white trousers, home-knitted white socks and traditional leather shoes with ties. He has an aluminium mask, is heavily bearded with sheep's hair, and carries a long stick. Again, what we saw had changed greatly. The baba wears the traditional clothes of a village woman, but with 2 comically stuffed breasts, a home-woven skirt wrapped around the body, with a corner tucked up with a leather handbag across the body. She has tights underneath the skirt, which is often lifted to show off male legs, and her knickers, and traditional leather shoes. Her papier-mâché mask has an exaggeratedly long nose, and she carries a spinning stick, to which are attached various objects, for example, an inflated condom, a nude plastic doll, often with missing limbs, a fluffy bear or plastic animal. However, the mosh we saw were often quite sinister, and here is a particularly sinister Baba with what looks like a dead baby. The leader of the group, the chef, directs all the actions. He wears the costume of a badana, but without the mask, and carries a large leather bag into which go the gifts of money the team receives, and he has a metal whistle which he blows to make the loud, shrill noises that accompany Capra on its processions. Sound is defining to Capra. The whole experience of Capra is clearly separated from the rest of village life by sounds that are only heard this time of the year. Each character has its own noise. For the horses, it is the sound of the jangling bells. For the badana, an unintelligible roar that resembles the cries of Roma traders selling house to house. The mosh and baba make no sound when parading, except when they swap to persuade a householder to accept the team to play in his courtyard. At this point, they become clever, fast talkers, often using foul language that would never be acceptable the rest of the year. The chef blows his whistle to keep the team in time and to add to the general din of bells and cries. He shouts instructions to the players. Between the various dancers, the chef makes set calls to the rest of the team, and they make shouted responses, all using their usual voices. But Capra does not only have sounds, it has music, and it is this which brings it to life and again defines the special time of the year. 3 musicians accompany the Campen Capra, a drummer, a trumpeter, and an accordionist. Each of the Capra's 3 groups of characters have their own dance which they perform. The music also emboldens the performers, encouraging greater mischief-making, more slang, more lascivious dancing. And these costumes and masks are prized and passed down families, patched and renewed as need be. But how is it that this masquerade has survived so long? Posey explained the festival in a number of ways, apart from the old idea of beating away the evil spirits at the turn of the year. She thought it could only be understood in relationship to the semi-self-sufficient village communities that existed in many parts of Romania before, during, and after the communist years. She showed how, in communist villages, where life was still very rural and difficult, to be hard-working was considered one of the most important qualities, with self-sufficiency the ideal, an attitude Posey thought predated communism. The week of Capra was the one time in the year when other values came to the fore. It is a carnival of inversion, with hard physical work no longer the chief virtue. So what was this village way of life? Here I draw on my experience when between 2002 and 2006 I spent many months drawing in Mullenkrav, a village down 13 kilometers of unmade road in Transylvania. It shared much of the way of life of Moldavian villages, except that it was religiously and ethnically more diverse. 90% of its inhabitants had left for Germany after 1989. The houses, though, did not remain empty, with others moving in. There were 4 different ethnic groups in the village, and I think about 6 churches. The largest group were Romanians, then Saxons, who largely had left for Germany, and then Hungarians, few remaining, plus growing numbers of Roma, by far the poorest households and badly treated by the other groups. I became as fascinated in the ways of life in these partially self-sufficient communities as in the Capra Masquerade. When I first arrived in Mullencraft, it was spring, and I was struck by everyone desperately wanting rain. Their crops depended on it, and where was it? Two Roma children walked down the village street with a large basket, and seeing a stranger, asked if I wanted to buy it for the equivalent of £2, a bargain for a bargain basket lover like myself. They took me back to their home, where their mum and dad lived with their 12 children in 2 rooms with large holes in the walls. Having given £2 for the basket, I was now treated as their benefactor, and here is their father, the basket maker. Later, I heard many complaints about the family, how feckless they were, how unrealistic, as everyone in the village already had a basket, so how could he expect to make money, as there were no more people to sell baskets to? But somehow, despite their poverty, they managed to bring up 12 healthy children, which seemed quite a feat to me. And here are a couple of sketches of the kind of huts that Roma were living in on the edge of the village. Back in the center of the village, the next person I got to know was Maria, who kept the village shop. I first saw her unraveling jumpers, she said, to make new ones for her children. She did not have much to do, and as I enjoyed practicing my Romanian on her, and she saw I admired her knitting, she suggested she sold me crochet covers for chair seats, and this led on to her suggesting I pay her for cooking supper, which was pretty necessary as there was nowhere to buy food as everybody grew their own. So gradually I came to know people and how they lived. Soon I noticed how skilled they were. The woman I stayed with for a few weeks one summer made bread, 10 loaves at a time, having grown the wheat and scythed, harvested and stored it in barns attached to the house. Many crops were pickled, and when the pig was richly slaughtered in the courtyard, the meat was treated in many different ways to last as long as possible. And here is an affumatoire for smoking the hams. In the autumn, wine was made from the vines that also created shade in courtyards, while in the spring wild leaves were collected for eating, and women talked endlessly about which leaf was good for which organ. Health was not something dependent on medicine, but on knowing how to live well and how to eat healthily from the land. In the autumn, vast quantities of walnuts were collected, and a delicious cake, kozenak, was made, which was eaten on feast days and celebrations. A plum brandy, zwika, was widely made and drunk in tiny glasses, with much toasting. Many women's kitchen tables were covered with decorative white tablecloths they had woven to be part of their dowry when married. It was not at all beginner weaving. I admired them and was sold one. And all these things, handmade as part of daily life, can be seen in the photos and videos of Masquerade, and are part of the skill set of those that made the fantastical costumes of Capra. One day in the Transylvanian village, a child came and asked me to come and have tea with her mother. I followed the girl back to her house behind huge decorated wooden gates to find her mother a weaver, working at a large old and unwieldy loom. She was making a tablecloth for a villager who had left in the 1960s and become a doctor in Germany. He returned each summer commissioning tablecloths for his friends in Germany. She was from Moldavia, and her mother was a weaver, whom under communism made carpets for the Russian market, and she had trained her daughter since a child to work in this business. But after 1989, the export of carpets to Russia collapsed, and she married a forester and came to Transylvania. Here we see her husband and daughter winding wool, with her loom to the right. A traditional Moldavian design carpet was on their floor with big blousy red flowers. These flowers keep appearing in photos of Capra costumes, and here in this photo we can see that design that was on their floor. While painting in the village, I stayed for about 3 weeks with the most skilled of women. Younger than me, Maria began life with very little, but when she first started earning, she saved and bought a cow, then saved and bought another, until she had a herd of cows and sheep. She then started buying a house, then another, got married, had 9 children, wove her tablecloths, prepared her 7 daughters' dowries, preserved the produce of the vegetable garden for a large family, and in her spare time volunteered for the church. And this is her calf, and here is her well in the courtyard, and her outdoor summer kitchen, and here her piglets. She also had her sheep's fleeces hanging up to dry, and from these she spun wool, felted and embroidered it, and made a waistcoat for her husband. I don't think she thought of herself as someone good at craft. These were just things she had to do, and if she did something, she did it well. She was, though, not an average village woman. The old textile skills had largely gone with the arrival of cheap goods from China. The male skills of woodworking, however, were still very much alive, with shepherds building their huts on high summer pastures, and sheepfolds beautifully designed, and huts for making soft cheeses that were the preserve of the shepherd to make. Hen houses and pigsties were other opportunities for originality. And some villages were full of decorative wood carving, both in the splendid gates that fronted courtyards of many houses, keeping animals safely in and others safely out, and on the tops of fences around houses. And here are some examples from villages in Moldavia when we visited in the summer. And here you can see the beautiful birds carved in the roof of this hut. And here are birds of tin, another material used in to decorate villages. And this is part of a very grand gateway in a village in Moldavia. I also noticed how often the word harnik came up. It was the highest compliment. Their idea of work was physical, working on the land, building, preserving food, managing the household. The Romanian households often did not consider the Roma to be harnik, as their roles of buying and selling or music making were not considered work. And they often also did not consider politicians, journalists, academics as people who worked. Here we see old ladies working the land and a homemade horse and cart on the right. It was striking how rarely people went into each other's houses. Instead, they met in the streets, and it was there that there was quite an evening passeggiata, with all people sitting on benches watching the world go by, and many villagers stopping to chat. Usually only close family members and godparents, a very important role in the family setup, penetrated these gateways, except for the time of Capra. And it was then that young people could get to meet each other and for romantic attachments to be forged in what were, for the most part of the year, very tightly controlled communities, full of older women, watching the every step of the young, and where there was very little privacy for young people to meet. Masquerade provided 5 days of partying, where the normal values of the village disappeared. But how did communism affect the village way of life? Villagers were impacted by the communist state in many different ways, and these impacts changed over the 40-year period of communist government. One government policy that began in the 1950s change village life through a wider policy to honour folk culture and its diversity, partly to show how the communist state created unity and harmony from many different cultures, and partly, as in other European countries, in reaction to the rise of mass production. In the 1950s, women's textiles were honoured at a time when their educational opportunities were growing, with many becoming teachers. In parts of Romania, large-scale collectivization did not occur because the land was too marginal and the ideal of the self-sufficient way of life remained. In remote villages, the state farms were often not set up, but they were collectivized under the Cooperative Agricola Poliția schemes, which were introduced between 1960 and 62. They were introduced by force, with only about 4 families in Câmpeni refusing to become involved, and these owned very marginal land, so probably were of not much interest to the CAP, as they came to be called. But under this system, some private ownership of land for growing of fruit, veg, crops and rearing of animals was permitted. Wine was allowed to be made, but the traditional, much-drunk plum-brandied suica was not, though in fact it continued secretly. To begin with, the deal was that 25% of their produce went to the state, but by the final years of Ceausescu, this had increased to 75%. There were regular inspections to count numbers of animals, but sometimes they were hidden, and for a small recompense, the inspector could sometimes be persuaded not to see them. So really, the self-sufficient way of life continued in many ways unchanged, and also, according to Posey, the value of harnic was not greatly altered during the communist regime, and then continued after 1989, with the job losses and uncertainties of life making self-sufficiency and the virtue of hard work even more necessary. But how did the communist state affect Capra? The communist state in Romania did not just take over land, it sought to take over the minds and hearts of all their people. And this affected Capra. This began in the 1950s with the setting up of Cămin Cultural, which are much like our village hall in every village, with a paid member of the state in control of a program of events that spread the ideology of the government through talks, puppet shows, performances, concerts, etc. This policy was later extended by Ceausescu through the movement called Song of Romania, through which he sought to legitimize his government by linking it with folk culture that predated communism. He funded research that sought to show how the ideals of communism chimed with these ancient traditions. The state organized large-scale festivals where, amongst other folk traditions, troupes of Capra performers would travel, often big distances to perform. These were televised and promoted as great national occasions, showing how deep communism was in the heart of the country's life. The festivals were also a way of diverting people away from the more pressing economic and social issues. The awarding of state-level prizes was by the Central Committee of Propaganda, and festivals were tightly controlled by the state. For a time, teachers had, by law, to become involved in Song of Romania activities as part of their teaching contracts. There were national school competitions for best costume and dance. In Câmpeni, the school teacher made new costumes for all the child performers, but made them of fine embroidery, so making them sweeter and more attractive, and she included girls in what formerly had been an all-male capra. She wanted, like the festival organizers, a more attractive capra, doing away with the ugly characters. New dances were invented to show off skills. The music became less raucous and more popular. What was a festival of inversion became attractive performance, celebrating female textile arts. A village near Campen was commissioned by the director of the local Camin Cultural to make a new set of costumes which again prettified and subdued Capua. Younger children were introduced and it became more docile. Wives accompanied their menfolk to the official festivals, with the state paying for travel, board and lodging, which Posey considered to be a way of taming their men of their drunkenness. She did acknowledge, though, that it was a rare trip away for villagers and was often much enjoyed. And so the state, in using Capua for political ends, tamed it and robbed it of its wildness. Song of Romania, many thought, damaged folk culture, compromising and de-energizing it. The subversive elements were done away with. Instead, villagers were turned into performers and praised for the quality of their performances. As in other avenues of life in Romania, by the 1980s more freedoms were curtailed and the Capua troops were not allowed to perform with masks on, or if they did, they had to register with the police and wear a number so they were recognizable. The bird costumes, for which masks were an integral part, could no longer be worn. Post-1989, masks were permitted and they did not have to wear identifying numbers, but they still had to register with the police. But what was the culture and status of Roma in the village I knew, and more generally in rural Romania? Posey noted that stories about Roma were often exaggerated and exoticized, making them stranger and more different than they actually were, as she said, more distant, more bewildering, more exciting. She felt that Capua took on many of the qualities that villagers projected onto Roma, their cleverness with language, their trading and bargaining, with being close to nature, of being singers and skilled musicians, and of using slang and bad language. Capua celebrates these qualities, which the rest of the year villagers did not recognizable as desirable. To be hardworking was what mattered. Yet she argues that subconsciously all knew that all these talents, including Roma ones, were needed to survive their hard rural life. And through Capua, they found a place in the culture of the village where this was recognized and celebrated. This dynamic of values did not change during communist times, and then after 1989, it perhaps became more pressing that the values and gifts that were projected onto Roma communities were needed more than ever to navigate their world of transition and uncertainty after the demise of communism. So what happened to Capua post-1989? Posey went to Campen for the last time in 1997, and no Capua took place. She thought there were a variety of reasons for this. One was the chance discrepancy between the number of young men, 40, and young women, 8, in the village. The other reason, people told her, was the growth of discos where young people could meet each other and which were cheaper and to which many more young people went. They liked the way that they could dance either as a couple or alone, unlike the village balls, which were necessitated partners. The village hall also became more expensive to rent at a time when people had less money. And what of Capua, 15 years after Romania entered the EU? It is a mixed picture, with villages becoming much changed through depopulation. It remains a subject of continued academic interest. One Romanian academic studied a Capua in 2015, which began in the docile style of Song of Romania. But after the prizes had been awarded by civic dignitaries, the troops regrouped in a nearby bar, where they enacted a raucous anarchic Capua, which continued when people returned to their villages. But now, We have Google Images and YouTube, and we can see something of what is happening. There are over 12 million views of the 17 Capra videos that I quickly found, and I suspect there are many more. Many YouTube films are in the style of Song of Romania, pretty and tamed, which now are a part of a marketing culture to grow the tourist trade, with the state supporting this. On the Ministry of Culture's website, it said, thus, the initiative of organizing and performing Capra, with some exceptions, no longer belongs to the members of the community, but to the cultural authorities. And museums and other institutions are also involved in mounting masquerades. However, there are other YouTube clips, often made with mobile phones, showing that its old spirit lives as lively and anarchic as ever. Maybe partially it is a tradition that has survived because, in an age of spin and fake news, Capra seems as relevant as ever. Perhaps we need him more than ever. Certainly, he shows no signs of going away. Thank you.